Hey there. Thank you, Dean. This is David Grindel. I'm with ACI, Director of Solutions Consulting for our Canadian office. I've been with ACI for over 15 years in the payments business. And the reason I'm your speaker today is that as the Canadian market moved to EMV over the last 6-8 years, I spent a great deal of time in learning the specifications, working with other regions around the world where ACI customers had moved to EMV, and then supported a lot of our Canadian customers in moving into this solution. And now that the U.S. has begun the same move, acting a bit of a support role to ACI in helping our U.S. customers move that direction as well. Our discussion today my presentations today should only be in the 40-minute range or so, giving us lots of time for questions and answers at the end. And I will cover off roughly these three central topics. I will not be going into details on EMV itself. ACI did a webinar late last year on EMV itself, and if you refer to the ACI EMV webpage, which I'll get to later in this presentation, you'll be able to see a recording of that webinar in which I go over some of the basics of what the EMV protocol actually is. Today I'll be focusing more about where the U.S. stood before the Visa MasterCard announcements. I'll discuss in some detail those announcements and its effect on the market. Then be moving into what's probably of most interest, which is what does this mean to you as acquirers? So acquirers today, we're targeting both retailers themselves as well as processors that are doing merchant acquiring, and we have lots of those on the line. And I will for a brief period talk about some of the solutions that are in the marketplace to help you address EMV. And then finally, we have some tips on what to do to attack the EMV project and how to get started. So starting off with EMV in the United States. Well, there's been, in the years leading up to the Visa MasterCard announcements, there was to some extent a great deal of confusion. Some major merchants had announced that they were moving to EMV, although not many, predominantly one large merchant. But more than else, there was a great deal of confusion about how card payments would evolve. The whole PCI issue was huge in terms of both cost and management attention in retail and merchant processing, and then a wide variety of technical solutions to address PCI requirements bubbled up through the marketplace. End-to-end encryption, tokenization, one-time use cards. There were a wide variety, and retailers and merchant processors were to some extent at a loss about where to invest their money. When you re-terminalize your entire point-of-sale fleet, it's not only a significant dollar expense, it's also a multi-year commitment. It's almost a generational, although I hesitate to use that word but it's a 5 or a 6 year commitment when you re-terminalize your base. Then while that was confusing from the security end, there was also an evolution of payments in terms of payment innovation. So card schemes and some issuers beginning to promote things like NFC in mobile payments. As a retailer, you don't want to be left behind. You want to have these acceptance devices available. It would be nice if there was some critical mass of payment cards there. But then you also had 2D barcodes and key fobs and contactless tap and go that was non-NFC with PayPass and PayWave. So as a merchant or as a processor, there was a lot of confusion about what direction to go and what standards to support. And the unfortunate outcome of that confusion was inertia, and so a lack of change. On the issuer side, just as you were probably aware, speaking mostly to an acquirer crowd, the issuers were having the same problems as their international travelers were starting to get declined overseas. Travelers in Europe today are expected to have a chip card, and clerks look quite suspiciously at non-chip and at unattended devices. If you are buying transit tickets, train tickets, parking, you simply cannot transact without a chip card. Finally, those conditions led a number of issuers to begin announcing EMV cards, but they were almost exclusively just for international travel. These were not for, with one or two significant exceptions, these were not for domestic use. Things finally came to head in the late summer and fall of 2011, and Visa and MasterCard finally made the mandated announcements that people expect are going to move the U.S. market. So they both independently, although suspiciously close together in time, announced dates, requirements for those dates, and in some cases sanctions to enforce the mandates that they put forth. Visa's announcement was mostly specific to the merchant processing business and didn't touch issuing or ATMs, whereas the MasterCard focus was mostly on ATM process. But since there's such an overlap of infrastructure and cards, obviously they both move the market along. Because there are both incentives and penalties involved, a lot of industry observers think this is finally the catalyst that is needed to get the United States on the way to chip, and also to future forms of payment such as NFC. Visa's mandate specifically requires that new merchant devices be capable of supporting contactless and NFC, and so they're poised to support the U.S. payment system moving into new types of payments. And on both sides, both the point of sale and ATM, the combination of sanctions and incentives help you put together your business cases to re-terminalize your fleets. I'm going to go through three similar slides. The first stepping through the timeline, and this first one is specific to merchants and their devices. So starting at the bottom down here with the announcement in August, Visa has one of their incentives is that they are going to give a break to merchants and merchant processors that have sufficient EMV devices in the field. I won't be able to go into the exact detail, but in a nutshell, if a sufficient percentage of your transactions come out of EMV-capable devices, you get a break on having to fulfill your PCI certification for that year. It's very important to note you don't have to have a certain percentage of EMV transactions, because you can't control the number of cards that are in the field. But you have to have a certain number of transactions that come from devices that at least were EMV capable. So if there had to have been an EMV card, it would have been processed as a chip card. And the ability to essentially avoid the cost of a PCI audit each year is a reasonably significant incentive. Will many people get there on October 1, 2012? Probably not likely, but I imagine you'll start seeing merchants getting there very soon thereafter. Moving another bit out to 2013, Visa's mandated that all merchant processors and acquirers have to have their systems ready for EMV and contactless. MasterCard's liability shift is also in April of 2013. It's very narrow, however, and applies to almost international ATM transactions, very specifically Maestro-branded cards. And then finally, the two liability shifts. The Visa liability shift in October 2015 for all point-of-sale transactions, excluding in-pump card readers, and then the petroleum retailers get an extra 2 years for a number of complicated reasons. Liability shift, for those of you who the term might be new, is a shift of liability to the weaker party in the transaction chain. If the issuer is only issuing mag stripe cards and fraud occurs, then they are liable the way they are today for that fraud. As long as you as a retailer or processor did everything properly, got the proper authorization codes, got a signature that is the real signature, you are fine. However, when the issuers begin putting chip cards in the field, and a chip card is presented at your device, but your device is not chip capable and you have to fall back to using the mag stripe, you are liable for any fraud, because the issuer did his job in getting a chip card in the field, and you as the acquirer are liable because your infrastructure wasn't ready to accept it. Oh, sorry. So staying on the diagram. So we feel that obviously these blocks are how soon we think the actual market participants will move. Obviously, merchant processors and acquirers are trying to upgrade their systems as quickly as possible, getting there by the April 13th date. Merchant terminalization, however, is a much difficult problem. Obviously, you'll be starting now, but the whole terminal selection process, the rollout, the programming, the testing takes a lot more. So, in general, Tier 1 merchants, the large national chains, will probably get to this within a year to 2 years. The experience in Canada is definitely that the Tier 2 and Tier 3 merchants take a lot longer to roll this out. And even in Canada, as far as we are down the project, there are still small single store operations that have yet to get chip card readers. As you can see, I foresee this taking well out 5 or 6 years. If I look at the issuer sides and the ATM networks, same announcements apply, but looking at the timeline, card issuers will update their infrastructure fairly quickly because that's a simple IT project. I say simple, it's actually quite complex, but it's an IT project like any others. Where they find difficulty is in getting cards. They need to get out their card processing, the issuing infrastructure, update that to issue EMV cards, which is a significantly more complex process for them. On the acquire side, you would not be aware of that. But even after they've completed the IT project, they then need to issue cards to all of their millions of cardholders, and no one does that en masse. That will be as cards naturally expire, replace them with chip cards. And in Canada, every major institution issued their chip cards over a 3-year expiry cycle. So even if they are issuing cards by 2013, they will still be finishing by 2016 and 2017. And then ATMs are very similar to POS devices. Some are immediately upgradable, and then over time, especially as you move into the white label and dial-up ATMs, those last few ATMs will take a long time before they're upgraded. So now that I've gone through those mandates, why as a retailer or as a merchant acquirer do you care? Well, you care because they're both incentives and penalties. If you can get your terminal base upgraded fairly quickly, you have the opportunity to save real dollars on your PCI audit costs. If, as a merchant processor, you don't have those things in place, and soon the penalties of the visa mandate will begin to apply. There was a real chicken and egg problem in getting EMV into the United States, or chip in general into the United States. I include things like NFC. Without cards and payment instruments in the market, there's no incentive for merchants and merchant processors to upgrade, and vice versa. If there's no acceptance, issuers are reluctant to spend the money to issue these cards. The mandates get this working on both sides. One thing I will say specifically to the merchants is that because you have the long rollout times of replacing all of your devices, especially think of a large multi-store chain department store with literally hundreds, if not thousands of stores and hundreds of cash registers per store, the rollout period is prolonged, so you need to get started on it early. It's almost more interesting when you move into the long term, however, because your ability to process chip, and I speak towards the acquiring processors as much as the retailers here, can actually be a competitive advantage. In Canada, the merchant processors, the large merchant processors, raced to be the first ones to be fully EMV capable and had their sales force calling on merchants with this as an advantage, that they could handle chip cards and provide a better transaction experience for the retailer sooner than the competition. There was in Canada, this has not been announced in the States, and I wouldn't guess whether it will come, but in Canada there was actually a discount incentive on interchange rates and merchant processing rates for chip cards. So the processors that got there first could offer a lower cost of processing to their retailers, and hence also drove competitive advantage. The person that got there first did actually win market share because they got to EMV first. On the ATM side, the competitive advantage comes more from an avoidance of loss, especially for financial institutions that are ATM acquirers. The counterfeit fraud virtually disappears to zero when it's a bank's card at their own ATM. And so getting both EMV cards out and their ATMs upgraded was a significant expense saving. And then lastly, because of Visa's announcement asking the terminals to be NFC capable, this means you are poised when NFC wallets finally begin to roll out in the United States. So this point would be the first polling question that we would like to ask. I'm sure that the Visa and MasterCard announcements are not new. This isn't the first time you've heard of them. So given that the announcements were a good 4 or 5 months ago, what kind of changes have you made? What plans have you begun to put in place for EMV? Now I'll pause here just for a second while you fill out those questions. Okay, that polling question will stay up there for a second, but I'll move on to our next section, implications for the acquirer. So now that you know a little bit about EMV and what's coming, what does that mean for you as a merchant or as a merchant processor? So the EMV specs affect every player in the processing chain. Starting at the right, from the issuer, from the scheme that has to set up their specifications and establish a key hierarchy, through the issuers that have to get the cards out into the market, to the consumers who receive a card, to the merchants who have to have new terminal infrastructure, train their clerks, have new disputes and returns policies. Everyone gets affected. So how does it affect you specifically on the merchant and the merchant processing side? Well, they group mostly into 3 areas. Obviously, the hardware replacements to accept these devices, the changes to your authorization and transaction processing systems, and I'll cover those in some detail. And the third, almost always forgotten area, is the whole area of customer service, and I'll address each of these in turn. So first starting with the point of sale, and I'll focus on POS and then move to ATM. So obviously, the device upgrades come first. Depending on the device inventory you have in place, you could be looking at full hardware replacements. Depending if you've bought relatively new devices, these could be field upgradable. You might have devices that have chip card readers if they're relatively new, but still could require a software update. All of these things need to be addressed. As a retailer, you need, or as a processor, you need to know what devices you have out there and where. You as a merchant or as a processor don't need to certify your devices. The manufacturer does that, but you need to be certain that you're buying devices that are certified. And there are long lists of certified devices on each of the scheme websites. The whole area of devices can be quite tricky. In the merchant processing world, it's very common that devices are swapped in and swapped out. There is, if you will, a hierarchy that devices come out of Class A merchants and are often swapped into Class B merchants and down to Tier 2 and Tier 3. And I will say that this was a real issue in Canada, and I bring this up a little bit later, that some very old point-of-sale devices were still existing in parts of the country that were almost, or literally had been, forgotten about, and it caused EMV compatibility issues. So having a good inventory of the POS devices you have out there is very important. The key management, there's very little that an acquirer needs to do in terms of the encryption and the security requirements of EMV, but one of them is that each of the POS devices is loaded with the keys of the scheme. This is akin to the stickers you have on the door of your store where you say what cards you accept. The terminal is loaded with the public key of each of the card brands you accept. I won't go into the cryptographic details. It's not a laborious process, but it is a critical one. And then finally, as I touched on the customer service side, there's a whole whack of training here. Customer training, they need to know how to use this chip thing. If they use NFC or if they use an EMV contactless card, like a PayWave or a PayPass, that's easy. They're used to that. But if they're moving to contact-based EMV, and for anything over a $25 or a $50 transaction they will be, there is a change to the way the consumer interacts at the point of sale. It's not a big one. They'll get used to it fairly quickly, but there are definitely some transitional and some training issues. Just as important is the training of your cashier, sales, and sales teams. Recognizing when they need, especially during the transition, they'll be getting magstripe with signatures. They'll be getting chip cards that may be signature-based and chip cards that may be pin-based. Because while people tend to think of EMV always being chip and pin, an issuer can put out a chip card that only requires a signature. And I believe some U.S. issuers are doing just that. It is permitted under the scheme. So there are training issues for your cashiers to always make sure they pick the appropriate form of customer verification. ATM transactions are almost always pinned, even on a chip and signature card, so that issue doesn't apply, but absolutely device issues need to be addressed, and unfortunately these devices are a lot more expensive than point of sale. Again, any ATM purchased in the last 3 years, maybe 4 or 5, depending on your manufacturer, might be field upgradable. There might be the setup for an EMV card reader to be installed. It may already have an EMV card reader that's disabled, and again, it just may need to require a software update. These devices, just like the POS devices, need to be configured properly and need to have the key certificates for the schemes. And again, make sure you purchase certified devices. Again, here, start with a good device inventory, understand what you have in inventory, and then begin your planning on how you'll be swapping that out over time. Not much of a customer problem around things like pins. What is an issue is customer training depending on the type of device. For the large, think bank-owned ATMs that suck your card right in, it's not an issue. But there are a number of white label ATMs or smaller dial-up ATMs in the States where the consumer maintains possession of the card in their hand and swipes it through a magstripe reader. They're going to have to either, for the dip readers where they insert the card, they have to learn to put it in and leave it in. Now, it's a self-correcting problem. If they take their card out too soon, the transaction's canceled, so they'll learn fairly quickly. But again, a training issue for good customer service. Let me move to this point, which is a fairly important one. The EMV specification is a very, very broad spec. There's lots of things that an EMV issuer can include or not include on their card. However, very few of them are mandatory. It's important to understand what Visa and MasterCard require as mandatory EMV features and support those. It's important in your market to know what your local issuers may be supporting. Maybe they are supporting some features that are optional, and you as an acquirer want to make sure you support those features. Okay, so continuing to move ahead, those were device upgrades. Now let's move to transaction processing systems. My apologies for the detail on this slide, but there's a lot to go into on this one. I will say that as an acquirer, a merchant processor, or a retailer, you do get off a little bit easier than an issuer. There is a lot of change required for an issuer to support the EMV protocol. A lot. There's encryption and authorization and lots of details around how to handle that card. As an acquirer, you face no new encryption and security requirements other than, as I said, loading keys into your devices. The EMV security logic all takes place between the device, the point-of-sale reader, and the card. And by the time that that data is handed to your terminal and to your switch and up and into the networks, you are just passing along data elements. There are some new fields that you'll have to update your switches to pass, and there's some new fields in the responses, the main one being something called an issuer script. During the transaction, an issuer can send a command down to a card, And these are mostly around risk and fraud management. The command could actually be to turn the card off. But it's also a customer service. If someone has blocked their PIN through, say, 3 PIN failures, the bank, the issuer, can send a command down to the card to unblock the PIN and allow the customer to use it again. That field comes down in the response message, and you have to update your systems to handle it. You don't do anything with it. I should say your switches don't do anything with it. All you do is you hand it to the card, and the card applies the script. I will say it would be a good idea to upgrade some of your log, make sure these fields are logged when there are issues and problems. It's very useful in diagnosing. The last one is probably the one that causes that you should be paying the most attention to, which is certification time. Once you've upgraded your switch interfaces, those are your interfaces to MasterCard, to Visa, eventually to Amex and Discover and anyone else who goes to EMV, you will need to certify just the way when you first joined that switch. If you can imagine every processor in the United States trying to meet the same dates, there is going to be a queue to get into line for those certification windows. So make sure you plan this as part of your project plan. One miscellaneous piece to worry about is, or to make sure you address, is the whole area of disputes and representative transactions. The EMV equivalent of a signed chit is something called a transaction certificate. The easiest way to think of it is a digital signature of the transaction. It includes a whole bunch of data elements from the transaction, signs them all with the keys of the card so that it's secure, but it is an electronic signature. It's merely a piece of data. And when you are representing a transaction in case there's been a dispute, all you need to send up is the transaction certificate, unless your scheme requests some of the other data along with it. So you need to be able to store these. It's not like taking paper chits and putting them in a file folder. They are actually, it's data. So you're going to want to be able to store this electronically, and if you really want to save some money, find a way to also present them electronically. This last piece, however, is the one I want to spend most of my time on, and that's testing. Because of the wide variety of devices, the wide variety of issuers, and how they set their cards, EMV cards have a great number of switches and levers and dials that the issuers can make them do all sorts of weird and wonderful things. What this leads to is an interoperability, the potential of an interoperability issue, that Bank A's cards at retailer B's devices work properly. Now, I will say that the U.S. as a late mover to EMV will probably have less of an issue. In some of the early regions that went, in Europe, specifically in Britain, there were large amounts of interoperability problems. Canada had fewer, but still had a few interoperability issues. So I would say the States is probably safer, but still you need a thorough amount of testing. Testing with a variety of cards, testing in a variety of situations. Test tools for this are a good idea because of the regression as you run through this testing again and again. One of the pieces of advice I had from an individual in the UK who actually ran an EMV implementation for a bank was that you, in your project plan, allow for a generous amount of testing and then double it. Then turning to the third area of changes you need to make, and this is in the dispute management side. Note that EMV will not completely eliminate your disputes. EMV specifically addresses some kinds of card fraud, counterfeit fraud, and lost and stolen fraud to be specific, but there are still other ways that fraud can be committed and disputes take place. So you will still have disputes. You will need to track your transaction certificates and be able to represent the new EMV data elements to your switches. I've touched on some of the merchant consumer training issues. Fortunately, most of our consumers are used to PINs from their ATM transactions, so if EMV causes more chip and PIN in the U.S. instead of chip and signature, There's not a large barrier there. During the transition, though, definitely your cashiers need to be aware of what's the appropriate customer authentication. And then finally, all the various ways in which people are going to come looking for help. Some consumers, but not many, will call up a merchant 1-800 number and ask about how their payments are working or if something's not working. I think more so for the merchant processors on the line, your merchants are going to be calling up with issues. Maybe not your Class A merchants who can self-train and self-support, but definitely the Tier 2 and Tier 3s will be calling your hotline to say, what happened to this transaction, or why didn't this work, or how did this, this reversal came through. They might call your 1-800 number. You no doubt have a merchant portal for some self-service. They might go there for information. You are going to have to, these areas of your business also have to be aware of EMV data and have both the information to help that merchant when he calls in and to help both diagnose and resolve the problem, if there is one, when he calls in. Okay, so the next couple of slides I'm going to talk about some of the solutions ACI brings to bear in the EMV world. I'm not going to go into a great sales pitch, but just cover off quickly some of them, and then we'll get to our last section, which is how to get your project started. So ACI brings 3 sets of solutions to bear. Our transaction processing products like Base24 EPS, Base24, and the Retail Commerce Server, and I'll touch briefly on those. We have a suite of back office products. Proactive Risk Manager and Case Manager do fraud and risk detection, and they can do that at a merchant level as much as at an issuer level. And Acquire and Interchange are merchant management and discount and interchange solutions. I'll speak more about our asset tool, which lets you do more in the way of testing. It's specifically designed to do testing of payments and is fully EMV compatible to be able to use for some of your EMV testing. Whether it's a device driving transactions at your switches or simulating a network so that your switch can drive transactions at it. Base24 EPS is ACI's current modern generation of payment engines. It's designed to be very flexible and agile to enable processors and institutions and retailers to react quickly and change to meet market requirements in a shorter period of time. Its design was specifically to allow configurability and scripting to enable you to react more quickly to the changes in your marketplace. The Retail Commerce Server is also a payment engine, but this one is focused specifically on the needs of merchants. In addition to the usual payment switching and authorization, Retail Commerce Server supports things like refunds and check processing and check payments and accounts receivable, gift cards, loyalty, stored value cards, and so on. All retailer functions that financial institutions and issuers don't usually require. It is fully PA DSS certified and fully supports EMV. The Retail Commerce Server as well, you can run in-house, and ACI offers a hosted solution so that we operate it on your behalf. ACI Acquire is a tool more aligned with the needs of a merchant processor, and it does merchant management, discounts, interchange rate processing. I mean, you'll see the list down the left. EMV, as I said in Canada, was treated differently in the interchange rates charged by the network to merchants and merchant processors. So your merchant accounting and interchange processing system should have the ability to be able to dive into some of the refinements of EMV and treat different transactions differently with different interchange rates. PRM and ACI Case Manager, as I said earlier, are for fraud and risk control. And usually we think of fraud and risk from the issuer side, but PRM is actually also used at the merchant. And one of Canada's largest merchant acquirer uses this tool, both these tools, to look for merchant fraud, whether it's an out-and-out fraudulent merchant, could be a collusive cashier, And your fraud tools need to also be aware of EMV data and the EMV data elements to help detect fraudulent patterns. You might find, for example, that a particular cashier has an unusually large number of chip failures and fallback to signature, or which indicates he's monkeying with the card reader. Like things like that. You need to be aware of EMV data to help you make a better fraud decision. And finally, as I said, the tool I'll spend a little more time on, which is Asset. Asset is a payment simulation tool. It's very specifically built for payments. Supports EMV out of the gate with an EMV test pack with support for both local and international networks. Asset's very scriptable. It's very configurable to your transaction sets, to your transaction needs. Even if you're not a Base 24 customer, if you have your own proprietary switch with its own proprietary message formats, you can configure those with the Asset scripting engine, and then use this for your functional testing, but more importantly, when you go into regression testing or performance and stress testing, to be able to ensure your systems can work at high volumes and high loads without failing. And then as you go through your project, you have a test baseline that you can run the exact set of test cases to make sure you get exactly the same results. Asset has a long list of customer references. I've thrown up only two, both institutions that use Asset as part of their EMV testing suite. There's also an add-in for the Asset product that lets you go directly to the card. That would be used mostly for an issuer, but sometimes as an acquirer, if you're running tests using a card and you're getting odd results, you may want to verify what is on the card before you start looking for bugs in your own system. Okay, I said I just run that fairly quickly. We're at 40 minutes, so we're moving into our last section, which is how you get started on this project. Well, you already started to some extent by listening to seminars like this. Get out there and get EMV training. There's lots of stuff online. I highly recommend the EMVco website itself. If you have trouble sleeping, you can download the actual specifications for EMV, although I wouldn't recommend it. But there are lots of good overviews, and just by sniffing around the internet, you will find lots of good information from both industry associations and from vendors on EMV. I highly recommend that you make sure both your business and your IT staff take this. EMV is not just a technical issue, and it is not just a business issue. Both parties have to participate. Use your vendors. Go to things like this with ACI, but talk to your device manufacturers. If you're a retailer and you're using a merchant processor, talk to your merchant processor. What is their state of readiness? When will they support what features of EMV? How will they help you get to where you need to be? Don't forget your settlement agents. It's not just the authorization of the transaction. There are new data elements that needs to flow through the settlement side of things as well. Make sure they're prepared for these new data elements. All right. One of the starting points is just to see where you are today. What devices do you have in inventory at both a hardware and a software level? Is your switch software ready? Is your acquiring system ready? Is your processor ready? And so on. This comment about begin simple. EMV is as I said, a very broad spec, and most issuing institutions are going to start with a fairly simple payment product. And once they're comfortable with EMV, my prediction is that they're then going to get more sophisticated. So the processing and the handling you have for EMV transactions should be flexible enough to grow with you in the future as new feature function begins to show up on those chip cards. And finally, as I said, IT and business together. This kind of the EMV project affects a wide range of units inside your business. It's not just for the payment people, it's not just for the security people, and it's not just for the business people as well. Everybody gets affected by this. As an EMV acquirer, you could even have customer service advantages depending on who you might partner with as an issuer, or you have a private label card with certain features available only to your customers. EMV can affect many different regions of your business. So the project is a project like any other. but I would really harp on the business evaluation stage. Be aware of what it is you want to do and how you can use EMV. See how it affects your organization. There will be an expenditure, so make sure you have senior executive support, whether you do that through a step investment structure where you ask for a bit of money, to prove what you need and then go back for the entire ask, or if funding is released in stages, you absolutely have to recognize there are funding requirements. Right? And once you know what you want to do and you've planned flexibility into that plan, then you can go through the planning and the development and the implementation and the deployment. There's a lot of flexibility around how you deploy. I'll touch on this a little bit later. It shouldn't necessarily be just a simple run through of your terminal base. Even here at the start of the journey, there's lots of things you can start thinking about. And I would suggest even before you start in on some of your project plans that you begin this kind of a thinking and development of ideas, because this will affect the project plans you put in place. Starting with, what do you have in place today on both your ATM and POS devices? What's out there? What do they support? Are they certified? What are your vendors' plans to get those devices certified? Are they field upgradable? Is there a cheap way or a less expensive way to get them upgraded? And so on. If you are re-terminalizing a large number of terminals, is this the opportunity to potentially consolidate models of devices? Maybe over time you've accumulated a wide variety of POS models from either a single vendor or, even worst case, from multiple vendors. And is this a good opportunity to consolidate that down to a smaller, more manageable number of device types and perhaps a smaller number of device vendors? Great time for a competitive RFP, although the vendors will hate to hear that. Recognize that the Visa mandates require that your devices support both contactless EMV and contactless transactions. That's like the PayPass and PayWaves, and be capable of NFC. So make sure that you have those requirements when you go to your device vendors. For the retailers on the phone, you have to think about your impacts at the store. The easiest one is signage around the point of purchase for the new payment types and pins and pin entry, and there's lots of examples you can look up to in Canada for those. But it's everything from payment types and express lanes, and do you put contactless devices into express lanes to try and make them go faster, and customer service desks for more complicated EMV functions. Think about cashier training and the like, and lead cashiers. Lots of impacts right down to the store level. As I talked about test plans, start thinking now about the test cases and the scenarios you need to test. This will be a bigger part of your project plan than you think when you start off. Training. Lots of people need to know about EMV, but I would caution you that it needs to be appropriate to the role. So cashiers need to know a certain amount about a chip card transaction, or a card that could sometimes be a signature and sometimes a chip, and other people might need to know more. Right? Don't assume that everybody needs everything, and absolutely do not assume that nobody needs anything. Your rollout strategy, and I touched on this a few minutes ago. You actually have a lot of flexibility about how you roll EMV throughout your point-of-sale devices. Do you do it geographically so that your implementation team moves efficiently around the country, and you go into, I'll pick a city, San Francisco, and you do all of San Francisco? Well, maybe you do it by regions that have high fraud. Maybe if a particular city is a huge source of fraud for you, you do those cities' terminals first. Maybe you do seed stores, and you do one main store in a particularly tight geographic region, so that that store can then be a training facility for the rest of the stores in the region. Okay, that one obviously has cost implications because you're visiting places twice. But think about those kinds. What is the appropriate strategy that is best for you and for your business needs in rolling out your point-of-sale device, your EMV devices, whether they're point-of-sale or ATM? And then make sure you work in lead times. I've mentioned there network certification, so getting in line with Visa and MasterCard. You may also have significant lead times for your point-of-sale devices. Think that just about every POS, every merchant in the United States over the next 5 years is re-terminalizing a significant percentage of their terminal base. There are going to be delivery delays and queues and lead times to get these out of the device manufacturers. ACI is definitely a source of information and help for you. As I mentioned, but this is now our third webinar on EMV. I highly recommend our EMV webpage, which you'll find at that link, aciworldwide.com/EMV. And we've also put together a piece specifically for acquirers, giving you some hints and tips on how to get going on the project. You can come to us for complete products, as I discussed earlier, or even just some consulting, and we're glad to come in and do anything from basic EMV training to reviewing your migration plans, technical consulting, or design and engineering. I will, again, emphasize EMV test tools are critical, and so you may want to give the asset product a second look. All right, so finishing up before we go to questions, 4 closing thoughts. As I said off the bat, get started on this early. Even if it's just thinking, if it's 2 people sitting in a room and thinking about some of the issues that can arise from an EMV project, get started early. It'll take you a long time to roll out your devices at the end of the project, but that's just operations. The hard work is up front, thinking and uncover all the issues that are going to affect you. Secondly, understand what it is you want to do with EMV. As I said, it's a very broad specification. When you have contactless, when you have NFC and people are walking into your stores and paying with a phone, how can you deploy that or use that to your best interest? NFC has a whole couponing and customer loyalty side. So what can you do in terms of mobile couponing to use the NFC capabilities, right? And if you're not doing it day one, what might you want to do with it in 12 months or in 24 months? Because you need to at least be aware of that when you're laying down your infrastructure today. Number 3, take advantage of the fact that the U.S. is the last major economy in the world to move to EMV. There's lots of proven resources and solutions out there in the marketplace. You do not need to build your own or have some science experiment. Use what's proven and out in the market that's been used in other places around the world. Save yourself the headache of breaking new ground. All right? There is one advantage to going last. The path has been beaten for you. Okay? And lastly, I ask that you take a bit of a mind shift. That EMV to most people, especially in the acquiring world, is always seen as a cost center. This is something that is going to cost me millions of dollars to roll out all these new devices. Yes, it will. But also look at the other side of that coin. How can you use something like EMV or NFC as a revenue generator? I talked about couponing in NFC, but even before you get to mobile, basic EMV has lots of abilities that an acquirer can still use in a revenue side. Whether you set up an agreement with a local issuer, a large regional bank in your area, or a national chain if you want, and you do a joint issuer-acquirer retailer program. You have a stored value application that you put onto a card of your own so that you treat loyal customers differently. And this isn't just a matter of, like a gift card. You can actually have an entirely different customer experience by having your own application on a chip card that's specific to your customers at your stores. Right? There are ways that you can look at this to generate margin, not just to be a cost center. So, just before we get to questions, then I'll throw up 2 last polling questions. We've done 3 webinars on EMV, and we'd be looking for your feedback. All of these categories are related to EMV. So, would you like to see us discuss mobile payments from an EMV point of view, fraud from an EMV point of view, generic merchant retail issues and EMV, or if you have another, then please type that in as well. And moving quickly then to a very simple yes, no, and I think I have to probably wait for the polling window to catch up. I'd appreciate your feedback just to know if you found this webinar informative, yes or no. So while you're answering those, I'd also then like you to think of any questions that might have come up, and I will address those as soon as we've done the polling questions. All right, so while you're finished the polling, I will start off. Actually, we're getting a very nice set of questions coming in, so I will start with the first question, which I will paraphrase, is asking about the difference between the networks. It's basically saying that between the three networks are all taking slightly different approaches. Some of the incentives only work if everybody takes a common approach, so what are acquirers doing? Are they working to upgrade? Are they waiting and see? I think at the moment we're all still, from what I have seen, acquirers and processors, and for that matter, I will say issuers, are all in the wait and see side. They're sitting back and seeing what the key specifications are that the institutions or the schemes are coming out with. To some extent, there's a bit of a competitive scenario going on where they're seeing what other issuers are looking at other issuers to see how they'll be approaching things. On the acquirer side, it's just waiting and seeing how the market will roll, and especially waiting for Visa, MasterCard to produce specifications. Okay, so what's next? There's a question about the PAN. Is the PAN encrypted in transit to the terminal, the payment switch, and the acquirer? So the PCI regulations still apply. So the PAN is still a field in the message, and yes, PCI requires that certain portions of that message, including the PAN, are encrypted. So those changes you made to your switches will still remain. The vast majority of the payment information, though, is encrypted as part of the EMV spec and rolled into something called, we'll get into the detail, an ARQC. There's a cryptogram that encrypts a great number of the fields in the message, but not all. So yes, things like PAN and some of the authentication data still needs to be encrypted the way it is under the PCI standard. Okay. Next. Are the EMV keys on? Okay, so we had a question about EMV keys in the PIN pad. Are the EMV keys only for the PIN pad to accept a specific card type? And yes, for each scheme, that being Visa, MasterCard, Discover, JCB, there are scheme keys that you load into the point-of-sale device. And that tells the card that it accepts this scheme. After that point, it gets into a whole bunch of cryptography to make sure that the issuer is authentic, because the interesting part about EMV is it not only authenticates the cardholder, or the card, I should say, but it also authenticates that the issuer is a valid issuer. So yes, those are entered directly into the POS device. Okay, all right. So there's a very good question about EMV announcements from some of the other networks, like Amex and Discover, and the differences between Visa incentives and MasterCard announcements and so on. This person's concern is 100% valid. There is a variety of approach coming from the various schemes. Some are still silent. MasterCard and Visa have incented different types of behavior and have different mandates. It is a difficult situation for an acquirer. You have to kind of find the common denominator so that you implement a system it satisfies all of the scheme requirements. I will speculate, only because it's happened in other markets around the world, that eventually the major schemes in the market, and by that I include the globals like Visa, MasterCard, Amex, as well as local regional brands and schemes, eventually came out with common specifications and requirements. It was not always a formal document that all the schemes would stamp and sign. In some regions that did occur, but individually they would issue specifications that were coordinated with other schemes. This has not happened yet in the United States. I would hope it does. I wouldn't want to guess hazard a prediction as to that, but I would hope that the U.S. schemes come up with something common that makes it easier for both the issuers and the acquirers. Someone has asked if they'll be sending a copy of this presentation. Yes, there will be a hard copy available afterwards. And there's another question about, asking me to elaborate a little on testing. This is what are some of the experiences on testing? Mostly, the difficulty in testing is the repetitive nature of the large number of test cases involved in an EMV card. There can be literally hundreds and multiple hundreds of test cases to ensure that everything works exactly as it's supposed to. And if you only had to do that once, that probably is not an issue, but as that needs to be repeated for multiple card brands, for multiple device types, and then over time, because you will change your systems over time, the regression nature becomes a real pain. That's where tool sets become very important. Okay, I notice we're approaching 3. I'm not sure if Dean wants this to cut, or let's at least take another question or two probably. There are a couple of individuals have asked questions about the PCI incentive by Visa and have pointed out that it doesn't really make much of a difference unless MasterCard also decides to do something similar. And yes, I would say that's a valid point that you should ask MasterCard and Discover about. As I said, until they come up with a common approach to incentives, and in particular like that one, that is a valid concern. If you are a Visa-only acquirer, it's great news. If you are an acquirer for both Visa and MasterCard, then you need to speak to MasterCard about having a common approach. About another new question, does Asset work with Retail Commerce Server? And yes, it does. Asset doesn't really care what it's speaking to. It simulates a point-of-sale device, or an ATM for that matter, and can drive transactions at that device. Sorry, at that software.
And David, it looks like a time for one or two more questions, please.
Okay. Yeah, I was going to say, so we're a couple minutes after, so I'll make it one more. An individual has asked what fraud is not trapped by EMV. So I'm glad to hear someone was listening, because EMV is specifically about counterfeit and lost and stolen cards. What's happened in other regions around the world is that the crooks have simply switched to other channels. EMV is very good. If you go to my first EMV overview webinar, there's some fraud details there from other regions of the world, but EMV is very good at suppressing the counterfeit cards. It works exactly the way it's supposed to work. Crooks have therefore gone to account takeovers, online banking fraud, let's see, first-party fraud is still big, so you'll still have all of those. First-party meaning the individual himself. So I deliberately, bust out. I open an account, I open a credit card, knowing full well I never intend to make any payments, run up $1,000 of the transactions, and then abscond with the money. So first-party fraud, account takeovers are still very big, even in the EMV world. And after that, I will hand it back to I'd like to thank everybody for attending. I hope this hour was valuable. And as part of the follow-up, you will be receiving a piece of collateral from ACI on how it covers many of these topics, helping EMV acquirers and merchant processors get to EMV. And then back to you, Dean.